When I was a kid, my parents sometimes left me home alone. Both of them worked, and they stopped hiring a babysitter when I turned 11. I was an only child, so I got used to the quiet pretty quickly. I knew how to make simple meals and snacks, but most of the time, I would just watch TV or hang out in my room. Our house was a single-story home with a small basement. There were 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms on the main floor, along with the living room and kitchen. It wasn't huge, but it always felt comfortable. At the time of this story, I was about 12 years old. One night, I was home alone. I don't remember exactly where my parents were, but both of them were out. My mom had left dinner for me in the oven before she left, so I ate while watching TV in the living room. After that, I went to my room. I spent the next hour or so playing a game on my tablet, lying on my bed and absent-mindedly glancing at the small TV in my room. It was around 8:30 or 9 p.m., fully dark outside. The winter chill pressed against the windows, and the house felt especially still. That's when I heard the sliding glass door open. The sound was unmistakable. We used that door all the time to access the backyard, and it had a specific metallic rattle when you slid it open. My heart sank. I knew my parents weren't home, so who had opened the door? We didn't live in the kind of neighborhood where neighbors would just drop by unannounced. A creeping fear settled over me. I sat up and stared at my slightly ajar bedroom door. The hallway beyond was silent and dark. I thought about getting up to close the door, but I was too afraid to make any noise. I stayed frozen on my bed, barely breathing. Something was wrong. I strained to hear, but there were no footsteps. The living room and dining area had old wooden floors, and anyone walking there would have made some kind of noise. But all I heard was the faint hum of the heater. Slowly, I reached for my tablet and dimmed the screen to black. The TV was already on mute, and the room was so quiet that the sound of my heartbeat seemed deafening. The minutes crawled by. Maybe I had imagined it. But no, I knew I'd heard the door. I kept replaying it in my head. Eventually, I gathered enough courage to check. I got out of bed and crept toward the hallway. To the right was the living room, but from my angle, I couldn't see the dining area or the sliding door itself. I took another step, my socks barely making a sound. The living room was empty. My pulse was racing as I crossed the room and peeked toward the dining area. The sliding door was closed, but unlocked. A shiver ran down my spine. I was sure it had been locked earlier. I walked over to the door, locked it, and carefully peeked out into the backyard. The patio table was still, dusted with a thin layer of frost. The small shed at the back of the yard stood undisturbed. Everything seemed normal, but that did nothing to calm me down. I went back to my room, trying to convince myself that I'd simply forgotten to lock the door earlier. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I pulled up the blinds and looked out the window. The backyard was empty, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. A few minutes later, I realized my glass of water was empty. I grabbed it and headed to the kitchen to refill it. As I stood by the sink, I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate. From the living room. My breath caught in my throat. My hand tightened around the glass. I knew someone was there. I didn't turn around. I didn't dare. The only thought in my mind was, run. Without thinking, I bolted toward the sliding door. I unlocked it, yanked it open, and sprinted outside. The cold air bit at my face, but I didn't stop. I ran across the backyard, out through the side gate, and onto the street. I didn't look back. I had my phone with me and immediately called my mom. My voice was shaking as I told her what had happened. She told me to stay where I was and that they were calling the police. I kept walking along the quiet street, looking over my shoulder every few seconds. After what felt like forever, my mom called again to ask where I was. Within minutes, my parents pulled up in the car. When we got back to the house, the police were already there. They checked every room, but found no one. Yet, it was clear someone had been there. A blanket from the couch was on the floor. The doors to my parents' bedroom and the basement, which had been closed earlier, were wide open. But nothing had been stolen. The officers searched outside as well, and that's when they found something else. A small, folded piece of paper tucked into the bushes near the patio. It had 2 words written on it. Smart boy. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, as though written in a hurry. I still get chills whenever I think about that note. We packed a few things and stayed at a relative's house for a few days. I couldn't sleep for a week. My parents eventually installed cameras and changed all the locks. But I never truly felt safe in that house again. The intruder was never caught. To this day, I'm grateful that I trusted my instincts and ran. But I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't. Last year, I moved into a small rental house on the outskirts of town. It was my way of escaping the noise and chaos of the city. The house was surrounded by trees, and the nearest neighbor was about a 5-minute walk down the road. It was exactly what I thought I needed, until I realized how isolating that quiet could become. It was a cold January night. Snow had started falling after sunset, covering the porch and the driveway in a soft layer of white. I was working late, finishing up some reports for my job, when I heard a knock at the door. It was strange. No one ever came out this far without a reason. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. A man stood on the porch, wearing a heavy winter coat and a knitted hat. His head was slightly bowed, so I couldn't make out his face clearly. "Can I help you?" I called out without opening the door. The man lifted his head slowly. His face was pale, his eyes sunken. He smiled, but there was something off about it. Too wide, too forced. "Car trouble," he said, his voice raspy. "Could I come in and use your phone?" A chill ran down my spine, and not because of the cold. "I'm sorry, I can't do that," I replied, "but I can call for help if you'd like." The man's smile faltered for a moment before returning. He nodded, but didn't step back from the door. "Sure, that'd be great," he said. I grabbed my phone and pretended to dial a number while keeping an eye on him. But something in my gut told me this wasn't right. The longer he stood there, the more I noticed things that didn't add up. His clothes didn't look wet despite the snow, and there wasn't any sign of a car on the road. I put the phone to my ear and spoke loud enough for him to hear. "Hello, yes. There's someone here who needs assistance with their car. Can you send someone?" The man didn't react the way I expected. Instead of relief, There was a flicker of irritation in his eyes. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Where's your car?" I asked casually. His smile disappeared entirely. For a long moment, he didn't answer. "It's further down," he finally muttered. I didn't believe him. My heart was pounding in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to keep the door closed. "Help's on the way," I said firmly, and took a step back. The man didn't move. His eyes locked onto mine through the peephole. "I really need to come in," he said. And this time, his voice was flat, devoid of the false friendliness from before. "No," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "You can wait outside." There was a long silence. Then, slowly, he stepped back off the porch and into the shadows. I watched as he disappeared down the path, blending into the falling snow. I locked the door and double-checked the windows. I stayed near the door for another 10 minutes, listening for any sound. Nothing. No footsteps. No engine starting. Just the soft hiss of snow falling. I tried to tell myself it was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I turned off the lights in the front room and peered out through a crack in the curtain. The road was empty. Just as I began to step away, I noticed movement. A dark shape at the edge of the tree line. I froze. The man was standing there, partially obscured by the trees, watching the house. My breath caught in my throat. He wasn't leaving. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 for real this time. "There's a man outside my house," I whispered. "He asked to come in, but something's wrong. He's still here." The operator kept me on the line, asking questions and assuring me that help was on the way. Minutes passed. The man didn't move. He just stood there, motionless. Then I heard a soft scraping sound near the back of the house. I spun around and ran toward the kitchen. The back door had a small window, and I saw it, a gloved hand pressing against the glass. He had circled around. The door handle jiggled, slowly at first, then with more force. The sirens began to wail in the distance, their sound growing louder by the second. The man let go of the handle and stepped back, disappearing into the night. I ran to the front door just as the police pulled up. The officers searched the property and the surrounding woods, but found no sign of him. There were no tracks leading away from the house, only the ones that led up to the back door. One of the officers stayed with me while the others continued to search. "Do you have any enemies?" he asked. "No," I said. "I don't even know anyone out here." The officer nodded, but didn't look reassured. They never found the man, and I never found out why he came to my door that night. A week later, I moved out. I couldn't sleep in that house anymore. Not after the way he looked at me through the window. Not after the silence that came after the knocks. Even now, I double-check the door before going to bed. And when I hear a knock late at night, I hesitate. What if it's that uninvited guest again? When I was 12, my parents started leaving me home alone during summer break. Both of them worked, and my older brother was usually out with his friends. I was used to entertaining myself. Most days, I'd sit at the computer in the living room, watching videos or playing games. It was quiet. just the hum of the AC and the occasional barking dog from down the street. It was early afternoon when I got up to grab something to eat. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and the windows overlooked the backyard. Our house was split level, with the basement windows positioned low to the ground. As I reached for a snack, I noticed something. A flicker of movement near the trees. I frowned and moved closer to the window. That's when I saw him. A man wearing a neon safety vest and a baseball cap. He was walking slowly along the back of the house, heading toward the basement windows. My heart skipped a beat. The meter reader, I told myself. They came by sometimes to check the water and electricity readings. I exhaled and tried to calm down, though the sight of a stranger in the backyard always felt unnerving. I went back to rummaging in the fridge, but after a few minutes, curiosity got the better of me. I glanced back at the window and froze. The man was still there. He wasn't writing anything down. He wasn't checking the meter. He was crouched near one of the basement windows, fiddling with something. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I couldn't see what exactly he was doing because of the angle, but his intent was obvious. He wasn't supposed to be there that long. I thought about going downstairs for a closer look, but stopped myself. If he saw me, what would he do? Instead, I tiptoed across the living room to another window that gave me a better view. I tried to stay out of sight. As I leaned closer, I accidentally bumped an empty soda can on the edge of the counter. It clattered to the floor with a loud clang. The man's head snapped up, his face twisted into a sharp glare. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second before he stood up abruptly and started walking away. I watched as he strode along the side of the house, disappearing toward the street. My pulse thundered in my ears as I moved to the front window. He didn't run. He didn't glance back. He just walked calmly down the street until he was out of sight. I sat down, still trembling, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe he was new to the job. Maybe he just didn't want to scare me by lingering too long. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. When my parents and brother came home later that evening, I didn't tell them. I felt ridiculous. What if it really had been the meter reader? I didn't want to make a scene over nothing. That night, the house settled into its usual quiet. My parents went to bed early, and my brother stayed in the basement bedroom while I stayed up late on the computer. The only light in the house came from the small lamp next to me. Around 1 a.m., my eyes grew heavy. I yawned, switched off the lamp, and headed downstairs to my room. To get there, I had to pass through the small basement den, which had a window facing the backyard. As I walked past, I glanced at the window and froze. There he was, a shadowed figure, crouching near the same basement window as before. My mouth went dry. The weak moonlight outlined the shape of his shoulders and the glint of something metallic in his hand. A scraping noise cut through the silence. He was trying to force the window open. I reached for the light switch, barely daring to breathe. My fingers found it, and the room lit up instantly. The man jerked back as though he'd been burned. I saw his face for a split second, furrowed brows, wild eyes, and then he bolted. The sound of his footsteps faded as he sprinted into the night. My heart was pounding as I turned and ran upstairs. I banged on my parents' bedroom door, yelling for them to wake up. My dad was out in the backyard with a flashlight within minutes. The basement window was scratched and bent, nearly pried loose from the frame. "He almost got it open," my dad muttered, inspecting the damage. I stayed on the couch in the living room that night, too scared to go back downstairs. I didn't sleep a wink. The man never returned, but for weeks after, I jumped at every sound. I kept the curtains drawn tight and double-checked the locks every night. Even now, years later, I avoid looking out of windows when it's dark outside. I know it's irrational, but sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't turned on that light in time.